The crystal chandeliers of the Metropolitan Museum's Great Hall cast a golden glow over New York's elite as they mingled at the annual spring gala. Jonathan Pierce stood at the top of the grand staircase, his silver hair and tailored tuxedo marking him as every bit the billionaire philanthropist the society pages claimed him to be. But tonight, his attention wasn't on the potential donors or business partners who sought his company. Instead, his steel blue eyes followed his daughter Sarah as she held court among her privileged friends. If you love your family and want to listen to amazing and shocking stories, click on subscribe and avoid 20 years of bad luck in your life. Sarah Pierce, 26, an heir to the Pierce fortune, commanded attention in her designer gown, her platinum blonde hair styled in elegant waves. She clutched her champagne flute while scrolling through her phone, her perfectly manicured nail tapping the screen as she showed something to her circle of friends. "Look at this." Sarah's voice carried across the marble floor, pitched just loud enough to draw attention. "They're letting these people camp out right in front of the plaza now. It's absolutely ruining the neighborhood." She turned her phone to show a viral video of a man in worn clothes being interviewed by a local news station about homeless rights. Jonathan's jaw tightened as laughter rippled through Sarah's group. He watched as his daughter continued, "I mean, if they want to improve their situation, they should just get jobs like normal people. But no, they'd rather beg for handouts and make the rest of us look at them." The surrounding socialites nodded in agreement, but Jonathan noticed several other guests shifting uncomfortably. He'd spent years watching Sarah develop into exactly the kind of person he'd tried to prevent: entitled, prejudiced, and completely disconnected from reality. Later that night, in the stark privacy of his home office, Jonathan rewatched the viral video Sarah had mocked. The man in the footage spoke with dignity about the systematic issues facing the homeless population. His name was Marcus Washington, and despite his circumstances, he articulated his points with an intelligence that belied his appearance. Jonathan's finger hovered over his phone. One call would set in motion a plan he'd been considering for months. It was drastic, perhaps even cruel, but he'd run out of options for teaching his daughter the lesson she desperately needed to learn. The next morning, Sarah stormed into the Pierce mansion's breakfast room, her heels clicking against the marble floors. "Daddy, we need to talk about the board meeting next week. I've been thinking about my role in the company." "And sit down, Sarah," Jonathan interrupted, not looking up from his tablet. "We have something more important to discuss." Sarah paused, thrown by her father's tone. She slowly lowered herself into a chair, smoothing her skirt with practiced precision. "What's wrong? Is this about the new foundation initiative?" "No." Jonathan finally met her gaze. "This is about your marriage." "My what?" Sarah laughed, but it died in her throat when she saw her father's expression. "Daddy, I'm not even dating anyone. You'll be married within the month," Jonathan stated flatly. "I've arranged everything." Meanwhile, across town, in a nondescript federal building, Marcus Washington adjusted his tie as he received his latest assignment. Gone were the worn clothes from the viral video, replaced by a crisp suit that spoke of authority and competence. "The trafficking ring has connections to the highest levels of society," his supervisor explained, sliding a file across the desk. "We need someone who can move between worlds, someone they won't suspect." Marcus opened the file, his expression remaining neutral as he studied the photos of elegant galas and charity events, similar to the ones where Sarah Pierce had been laughing at his viral video just hours before. What Marcus didn't know, as he reviewed the case file, was that his careful dance of deception was about to become infinitely more complicated. The trail of human trafficking he'd been following for months was leading him straight toward the heart of New York's elite, and directly into the path of a forced marriage that would test every skill he'd developed as an undercover agent. The stage was set for a collision of worlds that would shake the foundations of New York society, and none of the players yet realized they were all pawns in a game much larger than they imagined. The Cathedral of St. John the Divine stood imposingly against the grey Manhattan sky as guests filed into the historic church. The wedding of Sarah Pierce to Marcus Washington had become the talk of New York society, though not for the usual reasons. Whispers followed the bride as she moved through the cathedral's ancient halls. Sarah sat alone in the bridal suite, her white Pharaoh Wong gown spreading around her like frozen waves. Her fingers twisted the tennis bracelet on her wrist, a nervous habit she'd developed since her father's announcement. The door opened, and Jonathan Pierce entered, his expression unyielding. "This is insane, Daddy," Sarah hissed, careful to keep her voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the curious ears outside. "You can't seriously expect me to go through with this. He's nobody. He's your future husband," Jonathan replied evenly. "And this wedding will proceed exactly as planned. Unless you'd prefer to discuss your future inheritance." Sarah's mouth snapped shut, her perfectly applied lipstick hiding the trembling of her lower lip. The threat was clear: defy her father, and the comfortable life she'd always known would vanish. The ceremony itself was a masterclass in contrasts. The cathedral dripped with white orchids and crystal installations worth a small fortune, while the groom stood at the altar in a suit that, while well-tailored, clearly came from off the rack. Sarah refused to meet Marcus's eyes as she walked down the aisle, her steps mechanical, her smile fixed and brittle. Marcus, for his part, played his role perfectly. To the casual observer, he appeared appropriately humble yet dignified, exactly what one might expect from a man who'd caught the attention of a billionaire's daughter. But beneath his careful exterior, his mind worked continuously, cataloging faces in the crowd that matched surveillance photos from his FBI files. The reception at the Plaza Hotel's Grand Ballroom became a stage for high society's most uncomfortable theater. Sarah immediately separated herself from her new husband, floating between groups of sympathetic friends who offered thinly veiled condolences, disguised as congratulations. "Did you hear?" she overheard one guest whisper. "Jonathan Pierce's daughter married a homeless man. It's like something out of a reality show." Sarah's cheeks burned as she grabbed another champagne flute from a passing waiter. She'd positioned herself as far from Marcus as possible, but somehow his presence seemed to fill the entire ballroom. To her increasing frustration, she noticed that several guests appeared genuinely engaged in conversation with him. During dinner, Marcus began to speak, his voice carrying clearly across the elaborate centerpieces. He was telling a story about growing up in Baltimore, about community and survival, about watching his neighborhood transform through gentrification and displacement. His words were measured, intelligent, devoid of self-pity, but rich with insight. "The thing about perspective," he said, making eye contact with various guests, "is that it's usually limited by where we stand. Sometimes we need to move to see the whole picture." Sarah found herself listening despite her determination to ignore him. There was something in his voice, a quiet authority, an understated wisdom that made her usual social circles, conversations about yacht purchases and summer homes in the Hamptons, seemed suddenly hollow. As the evening wore on, Sarah watched Marcus navigate the crowd with unexpected grace. He discussed economic policy with a Supreme Court justice, debated contemporary art with a gallery owner, and spoke fluent French with an undiplomat. Each interaction chipped away at the narrative she'd constructed about him. "Your husband is rather surprising," commented Emily Matthews, Sarah's oldest friend, as they stood by the elaborate cake display. "For someone who..." She trailed off, taking a sip of champagne instead of finishing the thought. "For someone who what?" Sarah challenged, but her voice lacked its usual sharp edge. She'd been asking herself the same question all evening. Marcus Washington was not fitting neatly into any of the boxes she'd prepared for him. As the reception drew to a close, Sarah found herself watching Marcus with growing curiosity. He moved through the crowd with a confidence that seemed at odds with his supposed background, yet there was nothing artificial about his interactions. He listened more than he spoke, asked thoughtful questions, and showed genuine interest in others' responses. The image of the man from the viral video that had so amused her at the gala seemed increasingly distant, like a mirage that dissolved upon closer inspection. In its place was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve, a man who spoke of hardship with the insight of experience, but carried himself with the assurance of someone accustomed to moving through the corridors of power. In the weeks following the wedding, Sarah found herself living in an elaborate penthouse her father had gifted the newlyweds, though she suspected it was more about maintaining appearances than generosity. She and Marcus occupied separate wings, their paths crossing only occasionally in the shared spaces. But it was during one of these chance encounters that everything began to shift. Late one night, unable to sleep, Sarah wandered into the study and found Marcus surrounded by papers. He moved quickly to cover them, but not before she glimpsed photographs of people she recognized, prominent figures in New York society, including several close friends of her father. What caught her attention wasn't the photos themselves, but the detailed notes alongside them, written in a precise hand that spoke of professional training. "You're not really who you say you are you?" Sarah asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Marcus studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Who do you think I am, Sarah?" Instead of answering, she moved closer to his desk. "I've seen you on phone calls at odd hours. You disappear for stretches of time with no explanation. And just now, those papers." She paused, gathering her courage. "You're investigating something. Why do you care?" His voice was neutral, but his eyes were sharp, assessing. "A week ago, you couldn't stand to be in the same room as me." Sarah felt the familiar flush of shame at his words, but pushed forward, because nothing about this situation makes sense. "My father forcing this marriage, your unexpected knowledge of everything. I want to understand what's really happening." Marcus leaned back in his chair, making a decision. "What do you know about human trafficking, Sarah?" The question blindsided her. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Everything." He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the city. "New York isn't just galas and charity events. There's a darker side to all this wealth, and some of the people you've known your whole life are involved in things you couldn't imagine." Sarah felt her world tilting on its axis. Are you investigating people I know?" "I'm saying that your social circle includes individuals who profit from human suffering while hiding behind charitable foundations and political connections." Marcus turned to face her. "And yes, I'm investigating them." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She sank into a nearby chair, her mind racing through years of interactions, parties, casual conversations that suddenly took on new meaning. "Who are you really?" Marcus hesitated, then spoke quietly. "I'm an FBI agent working undercover to expose a trafficking network that operates at the highest levels of society." Sarah's first instinct was disbelief, but too many pieces were falling into place. The way he carried himself, his knowledge, his careful observations of everyone around them, it all made sense now. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you asked," he replied simply. "And because I've been watching you, Sarah. You're not the same person who mocked a homeless man in a viral video. You've been questioning things, noticing discrepancies. Maybe it's time you saw the whole picture." Their conversation lasted through the night, Marcus carefully explaining the scope of his investigation, while Sarah grappled with the implications. Each revelation forced her to confront her own prejudices and the carefully constructed worldview she'd inherited from her privileged upbringing. "The hardest part about privilege," Marcus said as dawn began to break over the city, "isn't just acknowledging that you have it. It's realizing that it often comes at someone else's expense." Sarah thought about all the times she'd dismissed people based on their appearance or social status, about the assumptions she'd made about Marcus himself. "I've been blind," she admitted, the words feeling insufficient but necessary. "We all start somewhere," Marcus replied. "The question is, what are you going to do now that your eyes are open?" As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the study windows, Sarah realized she was standing at a crossroads. Behind her lay the comfortable ignorance of her former life. Ahead, a path that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her world and herself. The warnings came in subtle ways at first. Marcus noticed the unmarked car that followed him for 3 blocks too many. The way certain doors that had been opened to him suddenly closed. The meaningful glances exchanged at social functions. The elite of New York were growing nervous, and nervous people made mistakes. During a charity board meeting, Marcus overheard a conversation between 2 prominent businessmen that made his blood run cold. "The FBI agent needs to be dealt with," one whispered, not realizing Marcus was within earshot. Jonathan's little marriage scheme was clever, but it's becoming a liability. Meanwhile, Sarah's own world was unraveling in a different way. While organizing her father's home office during one of his business trips, a task she'd done countless times before, she discovered a hidden panel in his desk. Inside was a leather-bound ledger with a familiar symbol embossed on its cover, a serpent wrapped around a globe, the same symbol she'd noticed on cufflinks worn by several of her father's closest associates. With trembling hands, Sarah opened the ledger. Inside were detailed records of transactions, coded but clear enough, dates, amounts, and initials that corresponded to missing persons cases she'd recently begun researching. The terrible reality of her father's involvement hit her with crushing force. She photographed every page, her photographer's hands steady despite her internal turmoil. When she reached the final page, a loose document fell out, a detailed dossier on Marcus Washington, dated months before their marriage. Her father had known exactly who Marcus was from the beginning. That evening, Sarah waited in Jonathan's study, the ledger placed deliberately on his desk. When he entered and saw it there, his usual composed demeanor flickered for just a moment. "I can explain," he began, but Sarah cut him off. "Explain what, Daddy? How you're part of a network that treats human beings like commodities? Or how you knew Marcus was an FBI agent and arranged our marriage anyway?" Her voice cracked with barely contained rage. Jonathan's face hardened. "You don't understand the complexities of the real world, Sarah. Sometimes maintaining order requires difficult choices." "Difficult choices?" Sarah stood, her hands planted on the desk. "You're talking about slavery, about destroying lives. I'm talking about maintaining a system that keeps our world functioning," Jonathan snapped. "Do you think your comfortable life came from nowhere? The clothes you wear, the parties you attend, the very food you eat, it all comes at a price." "Not this price," Sarah whispered, horrified by her father's casual justification. Jonathan moved around the desk, his manner suddenly gentle, almost patronizing. "Sarah, darling, you're upset because you're seeing only a small part of a much larger picture. Our organization maintains balance. Without us, there would be chaos." "You mean without your precious society?" Sarah challenged. "The one with the serpent symbol." "I've seen it, Father. I've seen everything." Something dangerous flickered in Jonathan's eyes. "Then you understand why this conversation needs to end here. Go home, Sarah. Forget what you've seen. Some knowledge is dangerous." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm protecting you," Jonathan replied smoothly, "just as I've always protected you. Marcus Washington isn't the first agent who's tried to expose us, and he won't be the last. But you're my daughter. Don't make me choose between you and the organization." Sarah backed away, suddenly afraid of the stranger wearing her father's face. "You already made that choice," she said quietly, "when you decided that profit was worth more than human lives." As she left the study, Sarah heard her father make a phone call. "We have a problem," he said to someone. "My daughter knows too much." "Yes, both of them. Handle it." Sarah's hands shook as she called Marcus, her world collapsing around her. The man who had raised her, who had taught her to ride a bike and checked under her bed for monsters, was himself the monster she should have feared all along. Emily Matthews had always prided herself on her observational skills. As Sarah's closest friend since childhood, She'd watched the transformation in her friend over the past months with growing curiosity. The once prejudiced socialite was different now, quieter, more thoughtful, and increasingly absent from their usual social gatherings. It was during a private lunch at their favorite rooftop restaurant that Emily finally connected the dots. Sarah had left her phone on the table while visiting the restroom, and a message notification flashed across the screen. Documents confirm connection between Serpent Global and missing persons. Need to move quickly. When Sarah returned, Emily studied her friend's face carefully. "You know," she said simply, causing Sarah to freeze mid-motion. "About the trafficking ring, about your father's involvement." The color drained from Sarah's face. "Emily, I have known for months," Emily interrupted quietly. "My father's private security firm handles some of their special transportation. I've been gathering evidence, trying to figure out how to stop it." She pulled out her own phone, showing Sarah photographs of documents, meetings, and warehouse locations. That evening, in a small coffee shop far from their usual haunts, Emily met Marcus for the first time as himself, not the persona he portrayed at social functions. "The organization calls itself Serpent Global," Emily explained, sliding a USB drive across the table. "They operate through a network of shell companies, all connected to major philanthropic foundations." Marcus examined the drive carefully. "This is dangerous information to have, Emily. Why help us?" "Because 2 years ago, my younger sister disappeared," Emily replied, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. "The police called it a runaway case, but I found her name in one of my father's encrypted files. She was merchandise." Her voice broke on the last word. Sarah, who had been quietly listening, reached across to grip her friend's hand. The gesture spoke volumes about how much she'd changed. The old Sarah would have recoiled from such raw emotion. Emily composed herself quickly. "Your marriage wasn't just about teaching Sarah a lesson, Marcus. Jonathan Pierce arranged it because he needed to keep you close, to monitor your investigation. But he underestimated how his daughter would change once she saw the truth." From her vantage point at a nearby cafe, Sarah watched Emily and Marcus deep in discussion. The sight of her best friend and her husband, the man she'd been forced to marry, but was growing to respect, working together created conflicting emotions. Pride in their courage, fear for their safety, and underneath it all, a growing warmth when she looked at Marcus that she wasn't ready to examine too closely. Emily's involvement changed everything. Her family's security firm had access to information that even Marcus's FBI resources couldn't reach. She knew the patterns of the elite, the hidden meanings in their social calendar, the real purpose behind certain charitable events. "The annual conservation gala next month," Emily explained during another clandestine meeting. "It's not just a fundraiser. They use it to auction off special commodities to their highest level clients. Everything is coded through art pieces." Sarah felt sick, remembering how she'd helped organize similar events in the past, never questioning why certain paintings sold for vastly inflated prices to buyers who showed no other interest in art. As they developed their plan to expose the network, Sarah noticed the subtle changes in Marcus when he worked with Emily. He was more relaxed, more himself, dropping the careful facade he maintained in public. She found herself watching their interactions with an uncomfortable knot in her stomach that she eventually recognized as jealousy. Late one night, Sarah confronted Emily about it. "You and Marcus, you work well together." Emily's knowing smile caught her off guard. "He's your husband, Sarah, even if it started as a forced arrangement. And from the way he looks at you when you're not watching, I'd say there's nothing forced about his feelings anymore." The revelation left Sarah speechless, forcing her to confront her own evolving emotions about the man she'd once dismissed so cruelly. The decision to actively join Marcus's investigation wasn't a single moment, but a series of small choices that led Sarah deeper into a world she once actively ignored. Her first real contribution came during a private dinner, where she recognized a pattern in the art purchases that had eluded even the FBI's analysts. "These aren't random sales," she explained, spreading photographs across their dining room table. "Each painting's price corresponds to a specific type of trafficking victim. I've been to these auctions my whole life. I know how they code the transactions." Marcus studied her with newfound respect. "You're sure about this? The Renaissance pieces are for Eastern European victims, modern art for Asian trafficking routes, and abstract works for domestic operations," Sarah explained, her voice steady despite the horror of what she was describing. "The prices follow a strict pattern based on age and specifications." She swallowed hard, fighting back nausea. Emily arrived later that evening with additional intelligence. The trio gathered in Marcus's study, now transformed into an operations center. "The conservation gala is our best chance," Emily insisted. "Every major player in the network will be there, including all 7 board members of Serpent Global. It's also the most dangerous option," Marcus countered. "Security will be tight, and if we're caught, we won't be," Sarah interrupted. "I've organized enough of these events to know every blind spot, every service entrance, every security shift change. And more importantly, I know how these people think." The planning consumed their days and nights. Sarah taught Marcus and Emily the subtle social cues of high society, the handshakes that signaled membership in the organization, the phrases that indicated interest in their special merchandise, the seemingly innocent gestures that marked buyers and sellers. During one late-night strategy session, Sarah found herself alone with Marcus in the study. "Why did you agree to this marriage?" she asked suddenly. "You could have maintained your cover without going this far." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Initially, it was the perfect opportunity to get closer to the investigation's targets. But now, he met her eyes. "Now I'm not sure that's still the only reason." The tension between them crackled with unspoken possibilities. Sarah took a step closer, but Emily's arrival interrupted whatever might have happened next. As the gala approached, their preparation intensified. Emily procured security passes and maintenance schedules. Marcus coordinated with his FBI handlers, ensuring backup would be in place, but invisible until needed. Sarah memorized the faces of every suspected network member, studying photographs until she could recognize them at a glance. "The key is to gather evidence of actual transactions," Marcus explained during their final planning session. "We need to catch them in the act, with undeniable proof." Sarah fingered the diamond necklace she would wear to the gala, now equipped with a sophisticated recording device. "And what happens after, to all of us?" The question hung heavy in the air. Emily would likely have to enter witness protection. Marcus's cover would be blown, ending his undercover career. And Sarah would have to publicly turn against everything and everyone she'd known her entire life. The night before the gala, Sarah found Marcus on their penthouse balcony, looking out over the city. "Having doubts?" she asked softly. He turned to face her, his expression serious. "About the mission? No. About putting you and Emily at risk." Every second, Sarah moved to stand beside him, their shoulders barely touching. "We chose this," she reminded him. "Some things are worth the risk." In the soft glow of the city lights, she could see the concern in his eyes, the weight of responsibility he carried. Without thinking, she reached for his hand. His fingers intertwined with hers, warm and steady. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she whispered, "I want you to know that you've changed me, changed how I see the world, how I see myself." Marcus's response was to pull her closer, and for a moment, they stood in silence. The city spread out before them like a sea of stars, each light representing a life they were fighting to protect. The Metropolitan Museum's Temple of Dendor provided a dramatic backdrop for the Conservation Gala. Ancient Egyptian stone walls watched over New York's elite as they gathered, unknowingly participating in a modern-day slave trade beneath the guise of philanthropy. Marcus adjusted his boatie, now wearing a custom tuxedo that Sarah had insisted upon. "The details matter," she'd explained while fitting his cuffs. They'll be looking for any sign that you don't belong. Gone was the deliberately understated wardrobe of his homeless persona, replaced by the precise elegance of old money. Sarah made her entrance separately, a vision in midnight blue silk. Her transformation was equally striking, not in her appearance, which had always been impeccable, but in her bearing. She moved through the crowd with purpose rather than entitlement, her eyes sharp behind her practiced social smile. Mrs. Washington, Gerard Blackwood, one of her father's closest associates, intercepted her near the champagne fountain. "We've missed you at recent events. Your father mentioned you've been unwell." Sarah recognized the subtle threat in his tone. "Actually, I've never been better," she replied, carefully activating the recording device in her necklace. "In fact, I'm particularly interested in tonight's offerings. I hear the modern collection is exceptional." Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly. "I wasn't aware you had developed such specific tastes." "My husband has opened my eyes to many new perspectives," she answered, watching his reaction to the loaded phrase. It was one of the code sentences they'd identified, a way for new buyers to signal their interest in human merchandise. Across the room, Emily worked her own angle. As the daughter of a security firm owner, she had legitimate reason to discuss protective measures with various board members. Each conversation was carefully steered toward transportation protocols and secure storage facilities. Marcus wove through the crowd, playing his role of social climber with practiced ease. "Fascinating piece," he commented to a cluster of collectors examining a particular abstract painting. "The asking price seems quite specific." "All our prices are carefully considered," responded a silver-haired woman Sarah recognized as a federal judge. "Each piece is unique in its attributes." The evening progressed like a deadly chess match. Each conversation was laden with double meanings, each gesture calculated. Sarah felt her heart race every time she spotted one of the predetermined signals: a handkerchief drawn across a lapel, a ring turned inward, a specific phrase repeated. Jonathan Pierce arrived fashionably late, commanding attention as he always did. His eyes swept the room, lingering briefly on Sarah before dismissing her. She felt, rather than saw, Marcus tense across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan announced, tapping his glass for attention, "the private viewing will begin in 30 minutes. Those with special invitations, please proceed to the Egyptian wing." This was the moment they'd been waiting for. Sarah caught Emily's eye and gave an imperceptible nod. The plan was in motion. The Egyptian wing, with its dimmed lighting and labyrinthine layout, had been chosen deliberately. Sarah knew from experience that the security cameras in this section experienced convenient malfunctions during certain events. As the selected guests filed in, Sarah noticed her father watching the proceedings with the satisfied air of a conductor before his orchestra. He had no idea that his carefully orchestrated performance was about to become evidence in a federal investigation. But just as the first coded bids were being placed, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Jonathan was speaking quietly to security personnel, and their eyes were trained directly on Marcus. The carefully constructed plan was about to unravel, and Sarah had seconds to decide how to protect both the investigation and the man she'd grown to care for, perhaps even love. The tension in the Egyptian wing crystallized as Jonathan's security team began to move with practiced precision. Sarah recognized their formation. It was the same one used whenever they isolated a potential threat at high-profile events. "The FBI agent has been identified." Jonathan's voice cut through the murmured conversations. "And it seems my daughter has forgotten where her loyalties should lie." Marcus maintained his composure, though Sarah could see the slight shift in his stance, a fighter's readiness beneath the tailored suit. The collected elite began to withdraw toward the exits, their practiced smiles never wavering despite the deadly undercurrent. Sarah made her decision in a heartbeat. She stepped forward, positioning herself between Marcus and her father's approaching security team. "Actually, Daddy, I know exactly where my loyalties lie. With justice." The gallery fell silent. Jonathan's face hardened into something unrecognizable. "Justice," he scoffed. "You want to talk about justice while destroying everything I've built, everything I've protected you with." "Protected?" Sarah's voice rose, steady and clear. "Like you protected Maria Rodriguez's daughter, or the Chen family's twins, or any of the other lives you've destroyed for profit." She began listing names, dates, transactions, information she'd memorized from the evidence they'd gathered. With each revelation, she watched the color drain from various faces in the crowd. These weren't just accusations. They were specific details that could only come from someone with intimate knowledge of the organization's operations. "Enough," Jonathan thundered. But Sarah pressed on. "The painting behind you," she pointed to an abstract piece, "is listed at $2.3 million. That's your code for European females, aged 15 to 18, isn't it? And the sculpture in the corner, $1.8 million for Asian males under 25. The wealthy crowd began to shift uncomfortably. Some tried to slip away, only to find the exits blocked by figures who had shed their maintenance uniforms to reveal FBI tactical gear. "You're making a terrible mistake," Jonathan warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "These people, this society, we maintain order, we keep the world running. Without us, without you, fewer children will disappear." Marcus cut in, his cover no longer necessary. "Fewer families will be destroyed." He moved to stand beside Sarah, their shoulders touching in a subtle show of unity. Jonathan's laugh was cold. "Agent Washington, did you really think I didn't know who you were from the beginning? This marriage was meant to be your prison, to keep you where we could watch you. Instead," he sneered at Sarah, "my foolish daughter actually fell in love with her jailer." "No, father." Sarah's voice was steel. "I fell in love with a man of integrity, something you wouldn't understand." The confrontation was interrupted by a commotion at the main entrance. Emily had arrived with the second wave of FBI agents, armed with hard drives and documents retrieved from Jonathan's private office during the distraction. "It's over," Marcus announced, his FBI badge now visible. "We have proof of every transaction, every victim, every conspirator." The elite facade finally cracked. Panic erupted as some tried to flee, while others immediately began offering to cooperate in exchange for leniency. But Jonathan remained eerily calm. "Sarah," he said softly, almost sadly, "you have no idea what you've done. The consequences are exactly what you deserve," she finished, watching as FBI agents approached with handcuffs. The Metropolitan Museum's grand hallways, usually filled with whispered appreciations of art, now echoed with chaos. FBI agents methodically detained members of New York's elite, while Marcus took control of the operations center established in what had been the private viewing room. "Ladies and gentlemen of Serpent Global," Marcus's voice commanded attention as he revealed his true identity. "For the past 18 months, we have documented every transaction, every shell company, and every victim of your trafficking network. The evidence is comprehensive and irrefutable." The collected evidence was staggering. Offshore account details, encrypted communication logs, and most damning of all, a complete database of victims matched to their buyers. Sarah watched as people she'd known her entire life, judges, CEOs, politicians, were led away in handcuffs. Jonathan Pierce, however, maintained his aristocratic composure even as he was detained. "Sarah," he called out to his daughter, "do you really think Marcus loved you? He used you, just as I used him. Everything was calculated. Every moment of your supposed romance was orchestrated for this outcome." Sarah felt the words like physical blows, but before she could respond, Emily stepped forward. "That's not true, and you know it," she declared. "I watched them fall in love despite their circumstances, not because of them. You're just trying to destroy the one genuine thing to come out of your manipulation." But Jonathan's words had achieved their intended effect. Sarah found herself replaying every interaction with Marcus, searching for signs of manipulation. Had every tender moment been calculated? Every shared confidence designed to further his investigation? Marcus approached her, his eyes troubled. "Sarah, was any of it real?" She interrupted, her voice barely a whisper. Before he could answer, chaos erupted near the main entrance. Several of Jonathan's security team, who had been posing as museum staff, initiated what appeared to be a planned extraction attempt. In the ensuing confusion, Jonathan broke free from his escorts. "The truth hurts, doesn't it, darling?" he called out as he moved toward a hidden service exit. "Ask your beloved husband about Operation Serpent's Tooth. Ask him who really orchestrated your marriage." FBI agents pursued Jonathan through the museum's labyrinthine corridors, while Marcus coordinated the response team. Sarah stood frozen, her father's words echoing in her mind. She'd never heard of Operation Serpent's Tooth, but the way Marcus's face had tightened at its mention told her it held significance. Emily grabbed her arm, pulling her to safety as more security teams clashed in the gallery. "Whatever your father meant," she said firmly, "don't let him poison what you and Marcus have built. He's trying to manipulate you one last time." Through the chaos, Sarah watched Marcus work. His movements were precise, his commands clear and confident, every inch the federal agent he'd always been. But she also remembered the quiet moments they'd shared, the vulnerable conversations late at night, the way his hand had trembled slightly when he'd touched her face for the first time. Agent Washington, a senior FBI official, approached with urgency. "Pierce is cornered in the Egyptian wing. He's demanding to speak with his daughter." Marcus turned to Sarah, his professional mask slipping for a moment to reveal genuine concern. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," she replied, straightening her spine. "Whatever Operation Serpent's Tooth is, whatever truth my father thinks will destroy us, I need to face it. We both do." As they moved toward the Egyptian wing, Sarah felt the weight of her father's final accusation pressing down on her. The night's revelations weren't over, and she feared the biggest shock was yet to come. In the dimly lit Egyptian wing, Jonathan Pierce stood before the Temple of Denda, his usual immaculate appearance now disheveled. A manila envelope dangled from his fingers, his last card to play in a game he was rapidly losing. "Looking for these?" he asked as Sarah and Marcus approached. "The complete files of Operation Serpent's Tooth, your precious FBI's master plan." He pulled out several documents, letting them fall to the marble floor one by one. Sarah bent to pick up the nearest page, her hands trembling as she read. The document detailed a long-term FBI operation to infiltrate Serpent Global, with a crucial component being the manipulation of a key member's daughter. You see," Jonathan's voice dripped with satisfaction, "your marriage wasn't my idea at all. The FBI identified you as my weakness months ago. They knew I would do anything to teach you a lesson, to shape you into a proper heir. Marcus was selected specifically because of your documented prejudices. They predicted every move, every reaction." Sarah's eyes raced across the pages. Psychological profiles, surveillance reports, detailed strategies for manipulating both father and daughter. Her entire relationship with Marcus had been outlined as a tactical approach, planned months before she'd ever mocked that viral video. "Sarah," Marcus started, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "Was I just another assignment, a calculated risk?" Before Marcus could answer, Jonathan pressed his advantage. "I tried to protect you from this truth. Everything I've done, even the trafficking, was about maintaining control, protecting our way of life. But he pointed accusingly at Marcus. "He deliberately played with your emotions as part of a government operation." Sarah continued reading, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she began to laugh, a sound that startled both men. "Oh, father," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "You still don't understand, do you? You're so focused on manipulation and control that you can't recognize genuine change when you see it." She turned to Marcus. "Yes, the FBI planned this operation. Yes, They chose me as a way to infiltrate my father's organization, but they couldn't have planned what actually happened. How you helped me see the truth about myself, about our society, about justice. They couldn't have orchestrated the real love that grew between us. Jonathan's triumphant expression faltered. You're being naive. No, Sarah, cut him off. For the first time in my life, I'm seeing clearly. You taught me that love is about control, that relationships are transactions, that people are commodities. Marcus showed me something different, that people can change, that justice matters more than profit, that real love grows even in the darkest places. Marcus moved to stand beside her. The operation was real, he admitted, but somewhere between the plan and the execution, something more real happened. I fell in love with your strength, your capacity for growth, your determination to right the wrongs once you saw them. Jonathan's face contorted with rage. You're both fools. When this becomes public, it already is. Emily's voice rang out as she emerged from behind a column, holding up her phone. I've been live streaming everything. The world is watching, Mr. Pierce. They're seeing exactly who you are, and who your daughter has become. The sound of approaching FBI teams echoed through the gallery. Jonathan Pierce, the man who had built an empire on human suffering, finally looked defeated. Sarah turned to Marcus, taking his hand. Operation Serpent's Tooth succeeded, but not in the way anyone planned. Instead of just exposing a trafficking ring, it exposed the truth about power, privilege, and the possibility of redemption. As Jonathan was led away in handcuffs, Sarah and Marcus stood before the ancient temple, its walls having witnessed yet another turning point in human history. Their love story, born from manipulation and prejudice, had transformed into something neither the FBI nor Serpent Global could have predicted, a force for justice, truth, and genuine change. What now? Sarah asked, squeezing Marcus's hand. Now, he replied, we continue what we started, fighting for justice, but this time, together by choice rather than design. The first light of dawn began to filter through the museum's windows, marking the end of an era of darkness and the beginning of something new, something real.